Now, for Across the Streams, we're going to talk about a couple of movies that are streaming right now. I was on Tubi, the people streaming service, and I watched a film that I had not seen since the 80s. And even in the 80s, I only saw bits of it. And it was a film called Fire and Ice, based on the artwork of Frank Frazetta. And I think he had something to do with the characters. This was a movie that, again, we were watching over a friend's house, which would usually happen. We would see films at friends' houses that we would never see at our own house because mom and dad would never rent Fire and Ice. But I remember watching it, and it was pretty much over my head because I was only a small boy at the time. But I remember being very upset when the puma died. And one thing that really bothered me as a kid, and I had several hot buttons as a kid when things used to really upset me, but even as an adult, if there's a scene where an animal is getting hurt, even a cartoon animal, I'm out. Like Dog Soldiers, I watched the first 5 minutes, they're killing the ant, and nope, done. The hell with that movie. Anything where they're killing an animal, I have a lot of trouble with it. It just really, really irks me, especially if it's related to a dog or a cat. I mean, it just really it hits home a little bit more because I love cats and I love dogs. And if I see them in pain or hurting, it really takes me out of the movie. It really bothers me. So I figured, oh, let me see this movie, and watching it again, let me see the whole movie. This film is terrible. Fire and Ice is a terrible film. I could barely sit through it. I was fast forwarding through most of it towards the end, and the movie's only like 88 minutes. So you're in trouble when you're dealing with that. Um, and a lot of those 80s animations that were like so big, and they were a big deal because they were not Disney, like Heavy Metal or Fire and Ice or Rock and Rule, seem like these movies that, oh man, I haven't seen that since the early 80s when we were really young. And you watch them again years later, and it's usually mixed to terrible, the reactions. So that was one case. Fire and Ice is definitely a case where I would say Tubi is free, but don't even watch it for free. Because I just think it's awful. But remember, this is just my opinion. It's not the truth. It's not a lie. It's an opinion. Horns down for Fire and Ice. So we're going to Disney Plus now, and I know I'm a bit of a Disney basher, it seems, and I don't hate Disney. I love Disney. Not recently. I would say probably since the Iger years, I've started having trouble with Disney because it's just basically repackaged nostalgia and a lot of really bad ideas and a really, leaning so much into the news of the day in your films rather than what works and what's good for the story. The story gets sacrificed for demographics and flowcharts, and we've got to satisfy this group, and this isn't working here. And they're very out of touch, it seems. And, we've seen that with some of the more recent Marvel movies. See, the Marvel movies were going really good for a while, up to Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Ever since Endgame, there hasn't really been much, with the exception of Spider-Man to a point, where I feel like, well, this is a great, great movie. I think that Spider-Man No Way Home was, again, still in that, very much in that Bob Iger obsession with nostalgia. And is it a good idea? Like, does it move things forward or does it take it a step back? And as much as I enjoyed the new Spider-Man, I did see it as a step back in some ways. And I think Marvel is really struggling now this year. And I enjoyed Doctor Strange, but this year between Doctor Strange and Thor Love and Thunder, their movies are getting weird. I didn't even see the Eternals, but from what I heard, it's weird. And I'm really hoping that Black Panther, which looks fantastic, Wakanda Forever, brings it back to an even beat, the way it was before Avengers Endgame, when it was all building towards something. And I honestly saw the thing from Comic-Con recently where they talked about all the brand new releases that are coming out. And I don't know, it all seemed very boring to me. Another Captain America, another this, another. Although I am excited for Guardians and Daredevil, of course, because it's Guardians of the Galaxy and it's Daredevil, which is very exciting news. But all the other stuff, I'm like, oh, I guess I'll see it, The enthusiasm just isn't quite there. And it's not that they're doing bad work. A lot of times they're doing good work. It's just we've seen it and we want to see something new. So I'm going to go to Disney Plus now that I've just bashed Disney. And the movie that I watched this few weeks ago, this video is late, was Lilo and Stitch. And the part of the reason I picked it is because I love that they have a soundtrack of Elvis tunes. Since this is basically an Elvis themed episode, I'll keep it up. The animation is great. This was a different film for Disney at this time because you got to understand during the 90s Renaissance, when Disney really made a major comeback, it started with The Little Mermaid, and they just keep topping themselves every time out. Little Mermaid goes to Beauty and the Beast, to Aladdin, to The Lion King. I mean, the post Lion King stuff isn't the greatest, but still, it's on a high level. It's on a much higher level than it was in the 80s. But the films were all more or less traditional, even if they tried to do things differently. Like Hercules did some interesting things with the soundtrack, and, Pocahontas, Hunchback of Notre Dame, which I thought was one of the best post Lion King Disney movies. They were definitely on a new level. And Tarzan, I'm a fan of. I'm a fan of Mulan. But Lilo and Stitch was interesting because it was so out of the blue. And it was so different and original. And I really like that about that. Because again, original. Not taking a tired old story and updating it, but this was something new and something exciting. Which is nowadays, you don't see a lot of that in Hollywood movies. It all is basically, repackaged stuff. And, I did like some of these nostalgia movies. Like I like Tron Legacy and I like The Muppets from 2011. Some of the Marvel and even some of the nouveau riche Star Wars I do like and I do enjoy, but these movies, because they're so heavy on the nostalgia, and then they try to do something new, and the new stuff they try and do isn't that exciting, and the new characters they have are not that exciting, these movies are not really going to endure and hold up, and that's part of the problem with nostalgia. But definitely check out Lilo and Stitch. Horns Up, it's on Disney Plus. Ohana means family. So we're going to close out the Cross the Stream segment with Stranger Things 4. Okay. Well, I've been on a really interesting journey with Stranger Things. It all started back in 2016 when I had heard about it on a great podcast from the Collider folks, and it was called Collider Nightmares, which was a great podcast about horror films and shows. They had seen a few advanced episodes and said it's really good. And I'm like, oh man, when that drops on Netflix, I got to check it out. Now, nobody in the world knew about it. So I watched it the night it dropped on Netflix. It was about, I was up late. It was about 3 a.m. And I watched the first 3 episodes. And I'm like, this show is incredible. And I finished it, I think, the next day. I think I watched 5 episodes in a row, or 6 episodes of Stranger Things. And I finished this first season. And I'm like, when it was done, I said, I love this. This show is great. Nobody's going to really like it. It's probably not going to go anywhere. It's not going to become a success. And Netflix is probably going to cancel it. But these 8 episodes alone, bravo. Great show. Then it became the biggest show on Netflix. And it just broke all kinds of records. And everybody was talking about it. And I worked in school. So all the kids were talking about it. I'm like, yeah, that show's awesome. And then suddenly for about 5 seconds, the students that I was substitute teaching started to think I was cool for about a second. That all ended, of course, but I was cool for about a minute because I like Stranger Things. and none of the teachers had seen it yet. And they're all like, oh, I've got papers to grade and I don't have time to watch stuff. And, but it was cool and it was something new and something different, and 80s nostalgia was in high gear at that time. It was like, 2015, 2016. So it was something really cool and different. Season 2 came out a year later, and I love Season 2. Season 2 is my favorite of the whole series. I still think it's great because, once again, it's about Will Byers and continuing his story, what's going on. I like that Paul Reiser entered the show. I'm a big fan of Aliens, so it was great to see him. I was very happy to see Sean Astin in his wonderful role. He was great. I just loved it, because it was very much like the first season, but it gave you a little more. Now, season 3. We waited a long time for this season, and I didn't like it. It didn't grab me. I felt it just felt weird. It felt like the kids started swearing more. They started saying things that were out of character and that they wouldn't talk like this. Their motivation seemed off. A lot of things just really bothered me about season 3, particularly the violence. Because there was violence in season 1, there was violence in season 2, but it seemed like the violence in season 3 was so horrific. And there was so many people. There's about one episode where like a whole bunch of people just die in this one episode, like 25, 30 people. I'm like, that's too high a body count for Stranger Things. Um, I love the chemistry between Steve and God, what's her name? Maya Hawke. I can't remember her character's name. Robin, that's it. But they had this great chemistry together, and it bothered me that Steve didn't get the girl because they had such a really nice chemistry together. And then they're saying because she's a lesbian, so they can't be boyfriend and girlfriend, but they're just friends. Guys in the 80s didn't have female friends. They didn't. I'm sorry. It just didn't happen. They had women that they worked with and women that they knew and stuff, but guys and girls being friends in the 80s? No. It just seemed like they had to do it because they were just throwing it out there. And it seemed very disrespectful. Like they should have been more honest about it, and it should have been something that the audience knew, but not Steve. And then Steve finds it out later, and what does he do with that situation? That would have been much better. But it was really upsetting to see they had this great chemistry together, and then like Steve doesn't get the girl yet again. That really bothered me because I'm not against these characters in the show or anything. That's perfectly fine. I just feel in this particular case, I really wanted Steve to, live happily ever after, as it were. But the rest of the season, again, I didn't like Carrie Elways at all, and I usually like him a lot. Princess Bride is one of my favorites. Obviously, he's a great actor. But I just felt like season 3 was just not the same. Also, the ending of it was completely ludicrous, where Sheriff Hopper goes from being this chunky local sheriff, suddenly becomes the Terminator, and he's in there, he's killing Russians, and he has a gun, and I'm like, this is ludicrous. Like, this, like, kidding me? So it just made no sense. But I was definitely in the minority because a lot of people I talk to hate season 3 and they hate season 2 and they love season 3. And I don't understand it. Like for people that question the logic of every Star Wars movie and say, well, how could this happen? That's not logical. And they let a lot of stuff in Stranger Things just walk right by him. And I'm like, all the stuff that I say, well, that's ludicrous and makes no sense. Now let's stop talking about season 3 because it sucked. We're going to talk about season 4. Again, too much violence. Again, the kids, all these curse words, they don't, I mean, maybe a little bit, but it seems like every episode, they sound the way they talk like older people and they talk like adults. They're not adults. They're still kids. I mean, not in real life, they're about 38, but according to the show, they're still children. So I just feel like, again, it's a bit much with the violence and the language and things like that. And I think that it should just be more back to it's like, Erie, Indiana with edge. That's what the show is supposed to be. Anybody that remembers Erie, Indiana, you're going to be applying for an AARP card soon. I'm with you. It's too long, season 4. And like I said, the violence and some of those things that I didn't like about it. However, it has a very, very strong story, and that's what makes it win out. That's what makes it a good, very good season. Season 1 and 2 are the best. Season 4 is right there with 1 and 2, like right underneath. The problem is the Russian subplot to me totally didn't work. I wasn't interested in any of that. Now, it was pretty cool at the end when Hopper is fighting off one of those creatures and he's got a sword and thing. It was pretty neat. But yeah, it was pretty, again, like we're making Hopper a little too much of a superhero. And that to me is just like rough, But definitely horns up. I'm looking forward to season 5. I have my theories about what's going to happen to the characters and all that. But again, Will Byers seems pretty much forgotten until the end of the season, where he's basically, coming out to Mike. But again, his character is just pushed to the side again, whereas in season 1 and 2, he was so important. So I think if there's one thing they need to do in season 5 of Stranger Things to really bring it home, is really emphasize the character of Will and the importance of Will and how this is all related to him somehow. And I feel like, the only thing they're giving him is like he comes out in season 5 and that's it. And that's all he gets as a character. But his character is so much better than that, and they have so much more to do with his character. And I feel like because they didn't give him enough to do in season 3 and 4, by the time season 5 comes out, and he'll probably end up being the hero of season 5, it's going to be a little late. And I don't know if it's going to work all together. And as a complete piece, I think we'll look back on this show sort of like The Sopranos in a way. Now, and I love The Sopranos, don't get me wrong, but it lost something towards the end. I would say the last 2 seasons started to lose me. The last season pretty much lost me. I still enjoyed it. I still watched it, but it was not the same show as when it started. And there are reasons for it. It's a long story why. But the problem with that is, and Stranger Things is the same thing, and this is what's going to happen to Stranger Things. What happened to The Sopranos is, yeah, of its time, it was very impressive and it was very different and it was not like anything else out there. But then it started to lose a little bit of itself, but nobody really criticized it or really gave it a hard time because, you know what, there was nothing else like The Sopranos. Until Breaking Bad, until another show comes along that's also a crime drama that stays great till the ending. There was no season of Breaking Bad where it fell off. Seasons 1 to 5 are excellent, and it was a show that I feel got better and better and better as it went along, and the last episode was a grand slam. Sopranos lost it in that last year, in my opinion. Again, this is just my opinion. And the finale was a bit of a disappointment, and it was a bit of a letdown. So, people are still talking about Breaking Bad, but outside of maybe me and a few of my friends, people just are not talking about The Sopranos as much. Similar thing with Lost. Now, I actually loved Lost till the end, but I'll admit that season 6 was not as good as seasons 3, 4, and 5. It was the last season, and some mistakes were made, and there were some things in there that didn't work for me. Even though I loved it to the end, and I did love the finale of Lost, I was in a very, very small minority by that point. Because by that point, people had pretty much all but given up on Lost. But again, I mean, there hasn't been anything like Lost since Lost, but a show is going to eventually come along that's a little similar to Lost, but it's going to stay on a certain consistent level to the end. And then Lost is Lost is already becoming a show that's being like, people don't talk about it anymore. And, it's a show that, like, at the time, everybody was talking about that show, So it's very important whenever, with the show, with the people that make shows, they got to really understand that. I know they're trying to make something great every time out, but they got to be, it's very hard to stay great till the end. Very few shows do it. And it isn't just the finales, and most finales are not good. There's basically, you can probably count on one hand the great finales of television. But at the same time, you got to understand that there is a lot of pressure, and it is very hard to make these things. Much harder than most people realize. But at the same time, through time, people will discover new things that do it better. And that's what ends up happening. The same thing with Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones was a phenomenal show until the last season. The last season was a disaster. And the last episode, it's true to life and it's realistic. And I do like that the boy who fell out the window becomes the king. I think that was very cool. But again, it's about the execution. And I think the execution was off in that last season. And they really lost me because I was really loving that show, and I actually binged the whole thing because I had never seen it when it was on, and I knew going in that the finale had its problems. So I watched the season before the final season, and I'm like, you know what? What if the show just ends here and I don't watch the last season? But then part of me was like, but you gotta watch that last season, even though you should end the show right here. This should have been the end of Game of Thrones. The second to last season ends pretty good. Leave it there. All the stuff between the brother and sister should have never been part of the storyline. That was a major mistake. And the final season was, to me, just some huge mistakes were made towards the end. I really didn't like what they did towards the end with Amelia Clark. I thought that was a huge, very tragic mistake how that series ended. And again, it's true to life, but I have no desire to ever watch it again because the whole point of fantasy is that it's fantasy. I'm not saying that it has to have a happy ending every time out, but the ending of Game of Thrones was just extremely depressing. And I don't know. I just think that there'll be something like Game of Thrones in a few years that won't end that way. And then nobody will even remember anything about Game of Thrones. By the time this guy publishes the last books, nobody's going to care. So he might as well just put out whatever he's got because nobody's interested. And the prequel series is not interesting to me. I'm not going to watch it. I'm not going to watch this Lord of the Rings show on Amazon. J.R.R. Tolkien? No. That is not Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry. It could be something else. Why don't you just make what you're making with Lord of the Rings, change the names of the characters, and then you can make it exactly the way you want it, that it fits into the fabric of today's society. But it's not Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings was written in the 1940s. It was published in the 50s, but it's an old story. It was written almost a century ago. So it's not going to be, there's nobody going to be running around with purple hair. There's not going to be any of the, well, what happened in the last 5 years? And how can we make a statement about Trump in this show? That's not what Lord of the Rings is. And Amazon has wasted a lot of money. They pissed off the fans. And let me tell you something. You think Star Wars fans are crazy? And you think Harry Potter fans are crazy, and they are, both of them, but I would never want Lord of the Rings fans mad at me. So anyway, we're going to watch a few more other movies in the coming weeks. There will be an episode at some point about the Black Phone. Actually, Chris and I recorded an episode about the Black Phone, but we had issues with the audio. So that one will not be released, but I am going to say that if you get a chance to see The Black Phone, it is by far the best film I have seen this year. It's not for everybody. It's extremely disturbing, extremely violent. This is a hard horror movie. This is not no Scream sequel. This is really, really like Rob Zombie level gritty horror film. But do check it out because it's not just a great horror film, but it's a great film. And we'll talk to you soon. This is Mostly Movies, signing off.